Hello, and welcome to part two of our background series on Exodus. In this part, we're going to look at the covenant and the golden calf that occur in the second half of the book of Exodus. Now, in the first half of the book of Exodus, we saw the people brought out of Egypt, out of slavery, to the base of Mount Sinai. In the second half of the book, they stay in camp at the base of Mount Sinai for about an entire year. They are there. Now, there are several things that happen while they are there. The first of them, and the most important of them, is the covenant that God makes with his people there at Mount Sinai. Now, we are not going to go into great detail about this covenant in this video because we will be talking about it in a sermon that will be coming up relatively soon here. But I do want to touch on a little bit about the covenant itself. When God made a covenant with Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12, he entered into this formal relationship, this covenant relationship with Abraham, whose name at the time was Abram. But the promises of the covenant were bigger than just Abram. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Abram was told was all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, we identify that as part of the scarlet thread that's pointing to Jesus and the things that are going to happen, bringing salvation to all of mankind. But I just want us to see that God's covenant with Israel that he makes here in Exodus chapter 19 carries a similar promise with it. God says, out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A kingdom of priests. A priest is a representative of God, and so they are representing God to the world as a holy nation. Now, later on, these phrases, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, are applied to the church and the followers of Jesus in the New Testament, and that is the role that we play as well. So God's covenant, while it is a relationship, a formal relationship with a specific people, has as its intention that it will eventually impact the entire world. And so God makes a covenant with the people of Israel here at Mount Sinai. Now he comes down onto the mountain in this very impressive and overwhelming display, and the voice of God speaks the Ten Commandments. The people hear them, and they are so overwhelmed by the voice of God that they go to Moses and say, don't let God speak directly to us anymore. You speak with God and then tell us what he says. Right? And so Moses becomes the intermediary, and so he goes up onto the top of Mount Sinai where God is giving him the rest of the conditions of the covenant. But he's up there a long time, almost 30 days, and so while he's up there, the people kind of forget about him, and they have then this thing where they make a golden calf. But I want you to understand, before we talk about the details of that event, I want you to understand a little bit more about a covenant. God's covenant with Israel, he says, you will be my treasured possession. And I want you to hear the depth of that, a treasured possession. God is saying, I'm going to enter into this relationship with you, and this is going to be a deep and meaningful, a loving relationship. As a matter of fact, we could say a covenant is much like a marriage, and like a marriage, a covenant relationship was meant to be an exclusive relationship. God speaks about this covenant through the prophet Jeremiah, and he says this, I gave them this command, obey me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. And so there's this relationship. I'm your God, you're my people. A covenant is much like a marriage. It's this exclusive relationship that is created between the two. So Moses is up on the top of Mount Sinai, receiving from God's own hand the tablets that contain the conditions of this covenant. And while he's up there, the people down below say, we don't know what happened to this Moses, and we don't really know this God, and so make us a god. And so they throw all their jewelry together, melt all the gold down, and create this golden calf. And the first question I want to ask about this situation is, why a calf? Why a calf? Aaron says, well, this calf jumped out at it. Well, that's clearly not true. But what we do know is that when they were slaves in Egypt, one of the Egyptians' gods was the goddess Hathor, who was the god of party and a bunch of other stuff, and was a favorite of slaves in Egypt. We have found in southern Israel, actually, a copper mine that was run by Egyptian slaves. Now, not the Israelites necessarily, but it was a copper mine run by Egyptian slaves, and right next to the copper mine, they have found a temple to the goddess Hathor. And the thing about the goddess Hathor is that the symbol of Hathor was a calf or a cow, right? And so when they make a golden calf, what they are doing is they are saying, we are going to follow this Egyptian God, not the God who brought us out of Egypt. So Moses is up on the top of the mountain, and God is aware all this is going on down there. So he tells Moses about it, and Moses comes down. When he sees what's going on, he throws down and breaks the tablets that have God's commands or the covenant pieces on them. And so the question is, well, why did Moses do that? On the one hand, we could just say, well, he was angry, and so he threw them down as an anger response. But there's something deeper than that. I think it's probably true he was angry. But there's a deeper symbolism here, because the tablets contained the covenant conditions. And when you throw down and break the tablets, you're signifying that the covenant that the tablets represent is broken, right? And so the Israelites broke the covenant by creating this golden calf and beginning to worship this goddess Hathor from Egypt. And so when you break a covenant, there are consequences that go along with that. And so Moses calls to himself the people who will be faithful to the Lord, and the tribe of the Levites responds and comes to him. Moses tells them to get swords, and they go through the camp and kill 3,000 people. Because you see, creating the golden calf was turning to a different God, and not just any old God, and not just creating a new God, but turning back to one of the gods that God the Creator has already shown himself to be greater than. They're being unfaithful while they're basically still on their honeymoon. And God was angry, rightfully so. They broke the covenant almost right away. And so Moses, after the whole thing with the Levites, goes back up on the mountain and begins to have a conversation with God. And God basically says to him, I want nothing to do with these people. He says, you go, but I'm going to stay here. I'm not going to go with you, because if I do, I will surely destroy these people. And so Moses has this whole conversation with God, where first Moses tries to argue that God needs to take care of his own reputation. What will people think? You brought them out in the desert just to kill them all? Are you too weak to protect them? And then Moses moves from God's reputation to his own personal relationship with God. Listen, God, we're close, and I vouch for these people. If you're not going to be with them, then I'm not going to have anything to do with it either. And finally, God relents. And what that does is it leads to something kind of amazing happening that we often jump over. But I want us to notice this. In the midst of that discussion, Moses asked God to be able to see him. I want to see you, God. And God says, you can't see me and live, but he eventually agrees that there is some way that Moses can view him. And so we are told then that Moses is allowed to see God as he passes by. And God himself gives us this description Listen to it from chapter 34. He, God, passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet, he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. So it's interesting. God himself reveals this description of who he is, and it is the very first time in Scripture that we get a picture of who God is. We can summarize this picture of God into two things. On the one hand, our God is a God of love. He says compassionate and gracious, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness. He's a God of love, and we can roll all of those things up into love. But the other side of this picture is our God is a God of justice. He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He is a God who is holy, who is righteous. And so he is both the righteous God, the holy God, and he is the loving God. And so how do we as people live in relationship with both the loving and righteous God? This is the question that we begin to answer in the rest of the end of Exodus and in through Leviticus and on then from there. But for now, we're going to stop here. We'll pick up with one more video about Exodus to come.